What do you know about life in medieval England under the feudal system? 1066 to 1485. Medieval England, spanning from the Norman conquest in 1066 to the end of the Wars of the Roses in 1485, witnessed profound transformations in its social, political, and economic structures. Central to these changes was the feudal system, introduced and entrenched by William the Conqueror, which defined land ownership, social hierarchy, and the daily lives of the English population for centuries. Let's explore what life was like in medieval England under the feudal system, examining the roles of different social classes, the structure of the feudal society, the impact of the manor court and forest law, and the evolution of education and social status during this period. The Norman conquest and the establishment of feudalism. The Norman conquest of 1066 was a turning point in English history, not only because it brought a new ruling dynasty, but also because it fundamentally altered the country's land ownership and governance structures. William the Conqueror, after his victory at the Battle of Hastings, sought to consolidate his power by introducing the feudal system, a hierarchical structure that dictated land ownership and the obligations of different social classes. Under this system, William claimed all land in England as the crown's property. He redistributed vast tracts of land to his Norman supporters, barons, knights, and church officials, who became his tenants-in-chief. In return for their land, these tenants were required to provide military service, pay taxes, and offer counsel to the king. This system of land tenure established a clear hierarchy, with the king at the top, followed by the barons and knights, and at the bottom, the peasants who worked the land. Peasants, or serfs, were bound to the land owned by their lord and were required to provide labor, crops, and services in exchange for protection and the right to work a small plot for their subsistence. This arrangement was both a form of economic organization and a means of social control, ensuring that the vast majority of the population remained dependent on the nobility and the crown. The role of the manor court and the administration of feudal justice. Central to the operation of the feudal system was the manor court, a local judicial body that dealt with a range of issues, from agricultural disputes to the enforcement of the lord's rights. The manor court was presided over by the lord or his appointed bailiff, and its decisions were binding on all the tenants of the manor. The manor court had jurisdiction over various aspects of village life. It handled disputes between tenants, such as disagreements over the use of common land, issues related to the maintenance of the manor's infrastructure, like roads and mills, and breaches of the peace. The court also enforced the agricultural calendar, ensuring that tasks such as planting and harvesting were carried out at the appropriate times. One of the manor court's primary functions was to uphold the lord's rights over his tenants. This included collecting rents, fines, and feudal dues, as well as ensuring that tenants fulfilled their obligations, such as working the lord's domain, the land retained by the lord for his own use, or providing military service. The bailiff, who oversaw the day-to-day running of the manor, played a crucial role in enforcing these obligations and managing the manor's economic activities. Punishments handed down by the manor court could range from fines and forfeiture of property to more severe penalties like corporal punishment. The court also had the power to impose amercements, fines that were often arbitrary and could be a significant burden on the poorer peasants. The manor court was a key institution in maintaining the feudal order, ensuring that the rights and privileges of the lord were protected while also providing a mechanism for resolving disputes among the tenants. Village life and the agricultural economy. Life in medieval England was predominantly rural, with the vast majority of the population living in small villages scattered across the countryside. These villages were typically organized around a manor, which served as the economic and administrative center of the local community. The landscape was dominated by fields, pastures, and woodlands, with agriculture forming the backbone of the economy. The agricultural system in medieval England was based on the open field system, where large fields were divided into strips that were farmed by individual peasants. These strips were usually allocated according to a system of rotation, ensuring that each peasant had access to both good and poor land. The open field system was communal in nature, with villagers working together on certain tasks, such as plowing, sowing, and harvesting. This communal approach helped to manage the risks associated with farming, such as bad weather or crop failure. Peasants in medieval England were divided into several categories based on their legal status and the nature of their obligations to the lord. The majority were serfs or villeins, who were bound to the land and required to work the lord's domain as part of their feudal obligations. Villeins were not free. They could not leave the manor without the lord's permission and were subject to various restrictions, such as the obligation to pay fines when their daughters married or when they inherited property. In contrast to villeins, there were also free peasants, known as freemen, who held their land independently and were not subject to the same level of feudal obligations. However, even freemen were not entirely free from the lord's authority, as they still had to pay rents and fulfill certain duties, such as participating in the manor court. The agricultural year was marked by a series of seasonal tasks, which dictated the rhythm of village life. In the spring, fields were plowed and sown with crops such as wheat, barley, and oats. The summer months were devoted to weeding and tending to the crops, while the harvest in late summer and early autumn was the most critical time of the year. The harvest was a communal effort, with all members of the village participating to ensure that the crops were gathered before the weather turned. After the harvest, the fields were prepared for the next planting season, and animals were brought in to graze on the stubble. The agricultural economy was vulnerable to a range of risks, including bad weather, poor harvests, and outbreaks of disease. Famine was a constant threat, particularly during the harsh winter months when food supplies were low. Peasants relied on a variety of strategies to cope with these challenges, such as storing surplus grain, practicing crop rotation, and supplementing their diet with foraged foods like nuts, berries, and wild herbs. The Forest Law and its impact on rural communities. In addition to the agricultural economy, the management of England's forests played a significant role in medieval life. Forests were not just areas of woodland, but also included open land, heath, and pasture, all of which were subject to the king's forest law. The forest law was a system of regulations designed to protect the royal hunting grounds, which were considered the exclusive preserve of the king and his nobles. Under the forest law, certain activities were heavily restricted or outright prohibited. Hunting deer, the most prized game, was strictly forbidden for anyone outside the nobility. Even the mere possession of a bow and arrow within a forest area could be grounds for punishment. The penalties for violating the forest law were severe and included fines, imprisonment, and in some cases, mutilation or death. The forest law had a significant impact on the rural communities that lived within or near the designated forest areas. These communities often depended on the forest for their livelihood, using it as a source of firewood, building materials, and grazing land for their animals. The restrictions imposed by the forest law made it difficult for peasants to access these resources, leading to tensions and conflicts with the authorities. The enforcement of the forest law was overseen by royal officials known as foresters and verdeers, who were responsible for maintaining the king's rights in the forest and prosecuting offenders. The harshness of the forest law and its enforcement made it deeply unpopular among the rural population, leading to widespread resentment and occasional uprisings. One of the most famous examples of resistance to the forest law is the legend of Robin Hood, who, according to popular folklore, was an outlaw who lived in Sherwood Forest and stole from the rich to give to the poor. While the historical accuracy of the Robin Hood legend is debated, it reflects the deep-seated grievances that many medieval peasants had against the forest law and the oppressive nature of the feudal system more broadly. Social hierarchy and the feudal nobility. The feudal system in medieval England was characterized by a rigid social hierarchy, with the king at the top, followed by the nobility, knights, and clergy, and at the bottom, the peasants who made up the vast majority of the population. This hierarchical structure was reflected in every aspect of life, from land ownership and governance to social customs and legal rights. The nobility played a central role in the feudal system, serving as the king's tenants-in-chief and acting as local lords over their own manors. These lords were responsible for maintaining law and order, administering justice, and defending their lands from external threats. In return for their services, the nobility were granted extensive privileges, including the right to collect taxes, levy troops, and dispense justice. Knights, who were often vassals of the nobility, formed the backbone of the feudal military system. In return for land or a stipend, knights were required to provide military service to their lord, which included participating in campaigns, defending the manor, and serving in the lord's retinue. Knights were also expected to uphold the code of chivalry, a set of ideals that emphasized bravery, loyalty, and honor. The clergy also held a privileged position within the feudal hierarchy. The church was a major landowner and played a crucial role in both the spiritual and temporal life of medieval England. Bishops and abbots were often members of the nobility and held significant political power, while parish priests served as the spiritual leaders of their local communities. The feudal system was not static, and social mobility, while limited, was possible. Ambitious individuals could rise through the ranks by acquiring land, marrying into a higher social class, or performing notable services for the king or a powerful lord. However, for the vast majority of the population, life was defined by their position within the feudal hierarchy, with little opportunity for upward mobility. Daily life and challenges for peasants. Life for peasants in medieval England was harsh and demanding. The majority of the population were engaged in subsistence agriculture, working long hours in the fields to produce enough food to feed their families and meet their obligations to their lord. The work was physically demanding and was dictated by the agricultural calendar, with periods of intense labor during the planting and harvest seasons. Peasants lived in small, simple houses made of wood, wattle, and daub, with thatched roofs and dirt floors. These homes were often shared with livestock, particularly during the winter months when animals were brought inside for warmth. The diet of peasants was simple and consisted mainly of bread, porridge, and vegetables, with meat being a rare luxury. Dairy products, eggs, and occasional fish supplemented their diet, and in times of scarcity, peasants would rely on foraging to survive. Seasonal food scarcity was a constant threat in medieval England, particularly during the winter and early spring when food stores were depleted and new crops had not yet been harvested. This period, known as the Hungry Gap, was a time of hardship for many rural communities. In bad years, when the harvest was poor, famine could strike, leading to malnutrition and increased mortality. In addition to the challenges of food scarcity, peasants were also vulnerable to disease. The medieval period was marked by frequent outbreaks of plague, smallpox, and other infectious diseases, which could decimate entire communities. The most devastating of these was the Black Death, which swept through England in 1348 to 1349, killing an estimated one-third of the population and leading to significant social and economic upheaval. Despite these challenges, peasants developed a rich communal life centered around the village. Festivals, religious observances, and communal activities such as the harvest were important aspects of village life, providing opportunities for socializing and reinforcing the bonds of community. The church played a central role in these activities, with the local parish church serving as the focal point of religious and social life. Education and social status in medieval England. Education in medieval England was largely the preserve of the church and the nobility. The majority of the population, particularly peasants, had little access to formal education and were largely illiterate. However, this began to change over the course of the medieval period, particularly in the later Middle Ages, when education became more widely available. The church was the primary provider of education in medieval England, with monasteries, cathedrals, and parish churches serving as centers of learning. Monastic schools, which were attached to monasteries, provided education for young boys who were training to become monks or priests. Cathedral schools, which were associated with major cathedrals, offered a more advanced education, often focusing on the liberal arts, theology, and the study of Latin. In addition to the church, there were also a small number of grammar schools, which provided education in Latin and the classical texts. These schools were often supported by local benefactors and were attended by boys from wealthy families who were preparing for careers in the church, law, or administration. The rise of universities in the 12th and 13th centuries marked a significant development in medieval education. The University of Oxford, founded in the late 12th century, and the University of Cambridge, founded in the early 13th century, became important centers of learning attracting students from across Europe. These universities offered a curriculum based on the study of the liberal arts, theology, law, and medicine, and were instrumental in the development of a more educated and professional class. While education was still largely restricted to the elite, there were signs of increasing social mobility in the later Middle Ages. The Black Death, which had a profound impact on the population and economy of England, led to a labor shortage that increased the bargaining power of peasants and contributed to the decline of serfdom. This, in turn, created opportunities for some individuals to improve their social status through trade, land ownership, or service to the crown. By the end of the medieval period, the rigid social hierarchy of the feudal system was beginning to break down, paving the way for the social and economic changes that would characterize the early modern period. The decline of feudalism and the rise of a centralized state. The decline of feudalism in medieval England was a gradual process that was influenced by a range of social, economic, and political factors. While the feudal system remained the dominant social structure for much of the medieval period, by the 15th century, it was beginning to be challenged by the rise of a more centralized and bureaucratic state. One of the key factors in the decline of feudalism was the increasing importance of money in the economy. As trade and commerce expanded, the cash economy began to replace the traditional system of land-based obligations. This shift allowed lords to collect rents in money rather than in labor or crops, which in turn reduced the peasants' dependence on their lords and undermined the feudal relationship. The Black Death also played a significant role in the decline of feudalism. The dramatic reduction in population led to a labor shortage, which increased the bargaining power of peasants and led to demands for higher wages and better working conditions. In response, many lords began to commute labor services into cash payments, further weakening the traditional feudal ties. The Wars of the Roses, a series of dynastic conflicts between the houses of Lancaster and York, also contributed to the decline of feudalism. The wars, which took place between 1455 and 1485, weakened the power of the nobility and led to the centralization of royal authority. The rise of powerful monarchs such as Henry VII, who established the Tudor dynasty in 1485, marked the beginning of a new era in English history, characterized by a stronger, more centralized state. By the end of the medieval period, the feudal system was in decline, and England was on the brink of significant social, economic, and political changes. The rise of a centralized state, the expansion of trade and commerce, and the emergence of a more educated and professional class all contributed to the transformation of medieval England from an agricultural feudal society to one on the brink of creating an empire. Conclusion. Life in medieval England under the feudal system was shaped by a complex interplay of social, economic, and political forces. The feudal system, introduced by William the Conqueror in 1066, created a hierarchical society in which land ownership and social status were closely intertwined. The manor court and the forest law played key roles in maintaining the feudal order, while the agricultural economy provided the foundation for the lives of the majority of the population. Despite the harsh conditions and challenges faced by peasants, medieval England was a society characterized by a rich communal life, deeply rooted in the rhythms of the agricultural calendar and the traditions of the church. Education and social status were closely linked, with limited opportunities for social mobility, though this began to change in the later Middle Ages. The decline of feudalism and the rise of a centralized state in the 15th century marked the end of the medieval period and the beginning of a new era in English history. The social, economic, and political transformations that took place during this time laid the groundwork for the emergence of England as a powerful and centralized state, poised to expand its influence and create an empire. By examining the lives of different social classes, the role of key institutions, and the broader historical context, we have gained a greater understanding of what life was like in medieval England under the feudal system. The legacy of this period, with its profound impact on English society and the development of the modern state, continues to be felt to this day. Thanks for listening. Like and comment. And please subscribe, as that will help us get more videos out to those interested in the Middle Ages. See you next time on Medieval Chronicles 1066. Stay curious.